welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of political commentary. We'll be looking at a recent, highly critical article aimed squarely at Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Now, right up front, I want to be clear. In this explainer, we aren't taking any political sides. Instead, our goal is to neutrally break down the exact arguments, the incredibly colorful rhetoric, and the stark contrast the author uses to build their case. It's honestly a masterclass in political critique, and by looking at exactly how the author structures their argument, we can get a much better understanding of their underlying message. Okay, let's dive into this with the author's biting central thesis. Right out of the gate, the article doesn't pull any punches whatsoever. The writer accuses the Prime Minister of this glaring political hypocrisy, saying the double standard is so thick you could spread it on toast. The author uses this really vivid imagery to hook the reader and immediately establish that this piece is all about a perceived massive gap between what the Prime Minister says in public and what he allegedly does behind closed doors. Section 1. The Prime Minister's Persona. So to make this accusation really stick, the author sets up an immediate and incredibly sharp contrast. On one side, you have the author's characterization of Albanese's public image. They describe a man who loves to lecture everyone about fairness and claims to stand up for the battlers, which, if you don't know, is a classic Australian term for working-class people who are just struggling to make ends meet. But the author immediately pits this against what they call the elite reality, creating this powerful narrative friction. They really want the reader to hold that battler image in their mind right before revealing a totally different reality about the Prime Minister's evening out. And this is where the author brings in some highly specific, striking details to completely shatter that public persona. The text points out that the Prime Minister didn't, show up to a community barbecue or a chat with struggling families. Instead, the author paints this picture of the PM rolling up to a high society event in a taxpayer-funded limo. And by specifically mentioning that the limo is taxpayer-funded, the author is subtly reminding everyday citizens that they are literally footing the bill for his transportation to this incredibly exclusive gathering. Moving on to Section 2, the Point Piper Dinner. Now, what's really interesting about this is where that limo was actually heading. It pulled up to a Point Piper waterfront mansion. And we have to talk about the sheer scale of the wealth at play here. The author makes absolutely sure to note that this property is worth a staggering $40 million. Point Piper is one of Sydney's absolute poshest postcodes. By emphasizing this $40 million price tag, the author is deliberately widening the gap between the PM's working-class rhetoric and the extreme, ultra-wealthy reality of his private engagements. But, as the author argues, it's not just about the house itself, it's about the hosts. The text provides a highly controversial financial pedigree for them. We're talking about the 25-year-old son of a Chinese high-roller property developer. And it gets crazier. The author details that the father's assets were actually frozen over a massive tax bill, and the family is known for pumping billions through the casino. In fact, the article points out this wildly ironic detail that the Australian Taxation Office, the ATO, actually has its name on the title of the very house the Prime Minister was sitting in. The author is just stacking these details one after another to make the reader question the integrity of the whole gathering. So, why exactly was the Prime Minister there, having intimate harborside chats with banking bosses and former premiers? Well, the author claims the golden ticket for this evening was a promised, cool $1 million donation to the Labour Party. The text sarcastically adds, "Nothing to see here, folks, just an ordinary night for the bloke who claims to be pure as the driven snow." The author frames this $1 million not just as a political donation, but literally as the price of access to the country's leader. Section 3. A Tale of Two Billionaires. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark juxtaposition the author creates. It's really the core of the whole critique. On one hand, we have Senator Pauline Hanson receiving a plane ride from local Australian mining billionaire Gina Rinehart. On the other hand, we have Prime Minister Albanese attending a dinner hosted by a Chinese developer's son with a high-roller family pledging $1 million in cash. The author is explicitly asking the reader to look at these two events side by side to highlight what they see as a massive contradiction in how different political donations are treated. To really hammer this home, the article reminds us of Albanese's reaction to that Hanson and Rinehart connection just days prior. The author describes the Prime Minister as foaming at the mouth over it, characterizing his attitude with this quote, "How dare Australia's richest person support a rival party?" The text argues that Albanese acted as if a local mining billionaire writing a check was essentially the end of democracy itself. According to the author, managing this contradiction requires what they call mental gymnastics and selective outrage. The piece argues that the prime minister treats an Australian billionaire as evil, but when a Chinese billionaire's son with a frozen asset mansion dangles $1 million, well, suddenly it's perfectly fine. The author describes this as the kind of selective outrage that would make a professional contortionist jealous, pointing out the utter absurdity of treating one source of wealth as a threat to democracy while treating another, with a highly questionable background, as a perfectly acceptable host.
Which brings us to Section 4, the hypocrisy accusation.
Moving beyond just the dinner itself, the author maps out exactly how this double standard is supposedly applied across the board. When opponents take billionaire gifts, the PM's reaction is to treat it as the end of democracy. But when his own party takes $1 million pledge, he treats it like a free entree. And it's not just the politicians. The author argues that if the other side of politics had attended this dinner, there would be scream and headlines for weeks on end. But because it's Albanese, the author claims the silence from his usual media cheer squad is absolutely deafening. The author's frustration kind of boils over here into a heavily sarcastic conclusion. They state that the prime minister has basically turned political inconsistency into an Olympic sport, and that right now he is going for gold in the rules for thee but not for me category. It's a really powerful rhetorical device, and it aims to completely strip away any moral high ground the prime minister might try to claim when it comes to political donations. So the crucial point is how the author views the PM's public lectures on integrity in light of all this. Because of this massive discrepancy between his public words and his private actions, the author argues it's no longer just simple hypocrisy, it is full-blown performance art. When the prime minister stands up in parliament and lectures others about pretending to care for battlers while taking billionaire gifts, only to then quietly slip into a mansion owned by people with frozen assets, well, the author wants us to see his parliamentary speeches as purely theatrical. And finally, Section 5. Who pays the bill? This brings us to a thought-provoking conclusion directed squarely at the everyday citizen. The author leaves the reader with a very specific mental checklist to keep in mind the next time the prime minister talks about transparency or standing up to powerful interests. They want you to recall exactly what we just covered. Remember the promised $1 million. Remember the Chinese developer's son. Remember the tax-frozen mansion in Point Piper. And remember the selective lectures about Gina Reinhardt. The author is really urging ordinary Australians to look past the soaring rhetoric and remember the cold, hard facts of this dinner. Because, as the author concludes, if this is what working for ordinary Australians actually looks like in practice, citizens really need to start reading the fine print. Which leaves us to ponder this final provocative question the author poses to the public. When the doors are closed on these $40 million mansions, who exactly is invited to the private table? And who's left paying the bill outside?